Well, my name is Professor Vasudeva. I work in the Department of Forest Biology. Uh, College of Forestry SIRSI is located right here in the Western Ghats. Those of you who are coming from away from the Western Ghats, I would like to now show you that my college is somewhere situated here in the northern part of Karnataka. This is Uttar Kannada district. And incidentally, my institute is a recipient of the Excellence Award in Forestry by the ICFRE in 2019. I will be speaking to you on approaches and methods of forest genetic resources of the Western Ghats. The flow of my talk would be like this. We will start with a simple definition of what is forest genetic resource and what are we talking about forest genetic resources, what is the worth of it, and then coming down to the Western Ghats, what is the total forest genetic resources of the Western Ghats, and then what are the prerequisites for converting uh, a biological diversity into bioresource. Let us also look at some salient results of our own work on the Western Ghats plant resource documentation, and then how this particular data can help in elite tree selection. We will also look at some small computation of how do we compute a resource value of a forest. We'll touch upon very briefly about the implications of Nagoya Protocol on forest resource utilization and little bit of practical steps for tree improvement and a looming immediate threat to these resources. Hope this particular flow of talk is compatible to all the senior officers. Let's start with a simple definition of what exactly is a forest genetic resource. The, the formal definition goes like this. It's a component of genetic diversity of forests, which is of actual or potential use. Actual use is that all our timber species, all our NTFP species are currently being used. They're the actual use. Potential use, for instance, you identify a weed to cure, let us say COVID conditions, then it is a potential use, which is used either in the production system or in the ecosystem functioning. Production system is all that we are now managing forests, including the plantations, and the natural ecosystems functioning of water provision and etc. So essentially, when we talk about forest genetic resources, we talk about everything in a forest. That is the sum and substance of this particular slide. Globally, the plant genetic diversity is categorized into three groups. One is plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and second one is plant resources for non-food utilization, and then wild genetic resources. When we are talking about FGR or the forest genetic resource, we will concentrate on roughly on these things. Apart from that, now we are actually trickling down to others also, like when we are talking about uh, food for forest or forest food, then we also talk about edibles from the forest. But roughly, we concentrate on wild genetic resources, medicinal plants, so on and so other kind of species. And all these species occur in various forms, and they also occur in different ecological settings. For instance, for the water to flow easily, we need to have the ecosystem correct. So we need to consider ecosystem. Like if you have one species like teak, which is having an extremely good value as a timber, then we should consider at the species level. Let us say within teak, Dandeli teak is having a specific criteria for selection, or let us say this is more preferred, then we need to consider that population also. Sometimes clonally propagated materials are important as individuals and genes. So for an effective utilization of the forest genetic resources, we need to consider all these levels. then what are we talking about? Are we talking about genetic resource which is just a paltry in its total economic worth, or are we talking about something substantial which is going to really create a lot of wealth? For that, we need to now look at what are the different products that we get out of the genetic resources. All our pharmaceuticals, 80% of them come from that. Botanical medicines, forestry and agriculture produces, ornamental, crop protection, personal care, and cosmetics. These are some of the products that we get out of it, and there is this definite market to each one of them. Each sector is having a huge turnover or the business volume. Now, there was one estimate of the annual markets for various categories of products derived out of genetic resources. Kate and Leard in 1999, quite an old data, created this data. They estimated what is the business volume of each of these categories. For instance, if you take pharmaceuticals, the global uh, total volume of business could be as low as around $75 billion to 150. So this is a lower estimate, that is a higher estimate. Likewise, you have for botanical medicine, forestry produce, so on and so forth, which amounts to something like around 500 to around $800 billion. Now, we are now talking about an industry which is having a total worth of around 500 to $800 billion annually, way back in 1999. Now, how does it compare to an extremely vibrant, like very big industry like the petroleum industry or software industry? If you do that, during 1999, the petrochemical was around $500 billion. Software and hardware put together was around $800 billion of total volume. That means the the market worth of the genetic resources is as high as the petrochemicals and the software. So we cannot ignore this particular sector. But unfortunately, we have been ignoring till date, and that's exactly the point that I would like to make. Now, coming to the forest resources of the Western Ghats, let me take you through some of these slides on the basics of the Western Ghats. We know that India harbors 4 out of 34 hotspots of biological diversity in the world. People know about only 2, but actually there are 4. The third one is actually the Eastern Himalaya, and the fourth one is the Andaman, which is a part of Sundaland biodiversity hotspot. Out of which the Western Ghats, which is a rolling ribbon of mountains from Gujarat to Kanyakumari, is one of the hottest hotspots of biological diversity. And it also has a very beautiful tag of natural heritage site, a World Natural Heritage Site by the UNESCO. In fact, geomorphically speaking, it is older than Himalaya, which has around more than 5,000 species of plants and 139 species of mammals, 500 species of birds, 22 endemics of them, 225 species of reptiles, so on and so forth. So it has an outstanding universal value for biological diversity. The plant genetic resources could be around 2,000 tree species or 200 undomesticated vegetable and forest food species. Medicinal plant resources, in fact, codified systems of medicine use something like around 2,000 species, of which 45% of the species are in some kind of a rare, endangered, and threatened category. And it is also a very rich repository of 230 wild edible fruit species. Considering all this, in fact, this is one of the richest of among the biological hotspots. When it comes to the resources, the Western Ghats is one of the most wonderful species, wonderful ecoregion. Having said that, what does it mean to a tree breeder? What does it mean to a forester? How do we actually utilize them? We particularly know today that the amount of biological diversity that a country possesses is equivalent to something like the resource capital. The biological diversity is considered as a resource capital of a country. Any element of biological diversity, if you want to convert into a biological resource, you must utilize them, at the same time conserve. So only when we know how exactly we can utilize and how exactly we can conserve, we can convert a biological diversity into a biological resource. But for an effective utilization of these resources, we must ask certain most important questions, which we call it as a prerequisite. So these are not just the questions, but these are the prerequisites for an effective utilization of the resources. The first prerequisite or the first question is, where are these resources? How are they spatially distributed? A policymaker like you, like he may have a question like this, like where do we have the highest number of individuals of, let us say, Sarakashoka, which is an extremely important medicinal plant resource of the Western Ghats. How do we quantify these resources? Suppose, as a policymaker, if you would like to order cutting off of, let us say, wild harvest of resources from the Western Ghats without harming the actual regeneration, we need to quantify. So are there any methods to quantify these resources? And are there any resource that is dwindling? Is the resource base dwindling? Which are those resources that are at a very high risk? And finally, what is the conservation implications of all this and how exactly we should invest both in utilization and the conserving these things. So only when you have some reasonably good answers to these questions raised, we may have some effective utilization of the resources. And actually, these questions can be now, actually, botanically speaking, can be connoted into three challenges, which is a little textual, but I would like to present this. For a sustainable utilization, we need to identify which are the resources, which is generally called as a Linnean challenge. And the second one is called as the Wallacean challenge, which we pose that where are these resources? And then the third one is how exactly these are influenced by the human societies, which is called as the Hutchinsonian challenge. So we need to understand these three challenges. And if we want to address all these challenges, we need to have certain broad approaches, like we need to have a clear building of an understanding of clear understanding of the system, like which are the resources to address the Linnean challenge, a clear understanding of the spatial distribution pattern of the resources to understand the Wallacean challenge, and we need to understand or build a clear protocol for sustainable utilization. So as a policymaker, as a forest manager, as a research scientist, you take any resource, we come out with these challenges and we need to solve this. We need to answer these questions. Answering these questions at a scale of global hotspot, you can you can answer it at a level of a forest, let us say range, or a forest, let's say circle. But answering these questions at a scale of global hotspot is really a daunting task, basically because if you consider Western Ghats, it's a very vast area. It's 1.21 square lakh kilometers. If you take a continuous length, which may vary from 1,500 to 1,600 kilometers, and a width of around 12.5 to 200 kilometers. And this actually runs in 50 districts, 208 taluks, 6 states, 1 union territory, administratively extremely heterogeneous. So that also poses a huge problem for assessment, utilization, and that. So whenever we are now trying to assess our resources, you may ask that we may have to do a censusing. So censusing is almost impossible. We need to go for sampling strategy. The sample should be uniform throughout the hotspot so that we may arrive at a quantitative estimation of the resource base. You may be wondering that these things are already documented. For instance, if you look at most of the botany books or most of the flora, you may find that this particular Ashoka is found in that particular region, etc. But these are all just anecdotal or some kind of a qualitative data which does not allow you to synthesize or compute a resource value or even to quantitatively assess the resources. So essentially, we need to have a very good sampling strategy. A sampling strategy may be extremely good, but if it takes 100 years to complete, let's say, forest, the ecoregion like Western Ghat, it is absolutely of no use. So we need to also have some kind of a very careful balance between the precision and the cost of the sampling strategy. So we need to do that. So at this juncture, when we were pondering about these questions about almost 10 years back, we proposed a project to the National Bioresource Development Board, which is actually a part of DBT, New Delhi. They awarded a project to us, the mapping and quantitative assessment of plant resources of the Western Ghats, headed by Professor Ken Ganeshaya of UAS GKVK. Broadly, the objectives were to quantitatively assess the plant resources of the Western Ghats, assess the threats to these resources, and develop some kind of a ecoregion specific database so that everybody can use, even right from the student of forestry to a policymaker, a forest manager should be able to use it to develop such an ecoregion specific database. So for this, what we did was we created or a grid system of the Western Ghats where we divided the entire Western Ghats into 3,300 grids. So what you see as a small checkerboard here, this particular grid is 6.25 into 6.25 kilometers, and then broad regions were identified as northern Western Ghats, northern central Western Ghats, central Western Ghats, south and southern central Western Ghats. And then plant enumeration was done by 5 different teams in 5 different areas. We used a range of layers like topo sheets, roads, rivers, FCC classification for stratification, NDVI, where for the recognition of a particular sampling point, etc. So within one particular grid, we ran a transect of 1 kilometer. So we literally walked 1 kilometer in randomly selected point so that we sample a heterogeneous habitat very clearly. Likewise, we had 3,300 kilometer data, and in fact, this was done by a multi-institutional project by different institutes. For instance, the northern Western Ghats was covered by Shivaji University, Kolhapur. The southernmost was covered by KFRI Pichi, and then Central Western Ghats was covered by our college in College of Forestry, SIRSI, so on and so forth. US Bangalore GKVK was also involved, and then there is another college in Karnataka, College of Forestry, Ponnampet in Kodagu, and then one organization called Ranma in Pune also was involved in North Central Western Ghats. It was a grueling field work. In fact, we used to take more time to reach the sampling point to actually run the transect. We sampled diverse ecosystems of the Western Ghats, shola forest, grasslands, mangrove, swamp, sacred forest. Whether it is a tea plantation or a coffee plantation, we did not differ. As long as it comes within the Western Ghats region, we sampled it. It was a very good show. I will only share about very few slides on the salient results here. We identified after 3,300 kilometer data, the number of trees that we identified were around 1,669. The number of herbs were 1,100. In fact, our data was not very good with respect to the herbs, basically because we could not go to the same place when it was actually raining, because we could not, herbs are very, very specific to time. So this is perhaps the biggest, robust and uniform sampling ever done to quantify the plant resources in any biological hotspots of the world. So we can be very sure that India has this primary data, which is of a resolution that anybody can compute quantitatively the resource. So for the first time, the primary data on valuable plant resources of the Western Ghats has been collected by undertaking a huge sampling effort. To our surprise, we encountered 388 tree species represented by a single individual in the entire 3,300 kilometer data. Similarly, 216 species were represented by only two individuals in the sample. So that means the number of species that are becoming endangered is much more than what we have imagined or what we have got it from the IUCN data. So we may have to redefine the rare, endangered, and threatened tree species of the Western Ghats based on this. This is one of the most important data point that I would like to share, that we need to really take into consideration the primary data and redefine the rarity of the tree species. All this data, along with, in fact, once we completed the Western Ghats project, the DBT was so impressive that it started simultaneously the Eastern Ghats and then Northeast India as well as Andaman. And this entire data set is available to anybody with this particular information network called Indian Bioresource Information Network, called ibin.gov.in. This is being monitored and then curated by Professor KNG. Suppose you want to now, let us say, get the data on any species in the Western Ghats, you can write to him and actually get the data. Some of the salient features are: suppose you consider top 20 abundant tree species of the Western Ghats, obviously T. conterminalia will become the first and second, followed by Memisilon, Syzygium cumini, Tomentosa, and so on and so forth. What was so surprising is Acacia auriculiformis, Anacardium occidental, Grevillea robusta. These are all introduced species, have obtained top 20 species, in the sense that we have literally changed the face of the plant resources on the Western Ghats by introducing these species to a very great extent. Thereby, we have actually contributed greatly to the changed environment and ecological setting of the Western Ghats. When we talk about the resources, this particular IBIN data is extremely useful. What I'm showing to you here is the distribution and density as well as the regeneration status of all red listed timber species of the Western Ghats. What you have here is some kind of a density depiction. If it is red, it is more dense, and if it is green, it is less dense. This is for the standing crop, and this is the regeneration. If you look at this, Uttara Kannada and Shimoga, they have an extremely high, both the presence of the red listed timber species of the Western Ghats. This was not known. In fact, we have not even bothered about making one particular protected area exclusively for red listed timber species or red listed NTFP species. So all the in situ conservation that is happening for the timber and non-timber, they are happening basically because of as a spin-off of the wildlife sanctuaries and the natural or the national parks that we have. So every small square here represents around 40 square kilometers area. So now you have that particular square of 40 square kilometer, or that particular range, forest range, where you have the highest presence of red listed timber species. Similarly, for red listed non-timber species resources. So this is one of the revelations to us that indeed we have different centers where we can identify highest richness of the non-timber, red listed non-timber species. Our data is also very crucial. You can also take it out. For instance, if somebody is interested to look at only Garcinia species, all the Garcinia species of the Western Ghats, this is the distribution of Garcinia species in the Western Ghats. Very clearly, the species like this uh, these green dots like Garcinia rubro icanita is restricted to small part in Kerala, whereas largely Maharashtra and Karnataka northern part has Garcinia indica. When you want for Garcinia gumigata, it is more in the southern. Look at this particular beauty of this particular data. Like most of the northern species have a southern limit in the northern Uttar Kannada district. Similarly, those species which are largely distributed in the southern districts have a northern limit in the southern in Uttar Kannada, making this is in fact the hotspot of biological diversity for the timber and non-timber species. So this particular point was not revealed earlier. Perhaps I may be wrong. So data can also be obtained for specific species like Garcinia indica, Indian gamboge. You have distribution, regeneration, age structure. Garcinia gumigata, you can see look at the age structure. And incidentally, for utilization of the resources, this is one of the best in a portal, basically because we could get variations which were not hitherto known. For instance, predominantly in case of kokum, this is Garcinia indica, which is called as kokum. We used to know one is red, another is white. These two are the predominantly known. White is quite rare. So if you go and see about 10,000 trees, one tree will be white. Because of the large number of data and also the diverse habitats that we have sampled, today we now know that these all of them belong to the same species, and all of them can yield an excellent Garcinia, and each one of them have their own unique properties. Nutraceutically also they are extremely different, not necessarily morphologically. Look at the green kind of the Garcinia, which we have never heard of. In fact, for fun, we did this work. Though Garcinia indica, which is extremely popular, but it's poorly studied when it comes to the nutraceutical potentiality. We looked at the ascorbic acid content, HCA content, anthocyanin content. We found that some of the morphological traits are 15 times, some of the genotypes have 15 times higher concentration of vitamin C than the oranges. So this is one of the spin-off of this particular spatially explicit data on where do we find this. Look at the implications of utilization. Suppose a beverage making company wants to prepare high sugar, high low HCA content, high ascorbic acid content. They can now look at these particular specific parts of the Western Ghats and then start doing some kind of a fine scale analysis of it. A policymaker like you, if you want to now, let us say, improve the nutritional status of the primary school children, you can just go and plant these wonderful tree species in the premises of the school, 5 to 10 trees. The children can eat very happily, though it's little sour, or can be converted into beverage, and you need not have to go for the popularization of oranges. This is a native fruit that we have. So the broad approach is that building a spatially explicit database of resources actually can help in understanding the structure dynamics of the natural habitats. We can recognize hotspots of biological diversity, especially endemic diversity of our resources, and eventually help in elite line production. And most importantly, it would all offer a perspective on the sustainable utilization of this particular resource. So, yeah, the second thing is that I would also like to give you few approaches that we have adopted to go for a light line selection of the economically important species using this fine scale database. Let me introduce to you the cousin of uh, kokum. The first one is Garcinia indica. This is Garcinia gummigata. This is actually a nature's bounty. One can say this is a nature's bounty. You know why? The outer rind is very sour. When it is dried, it looks like this. This is a nativity product where people use it for mutton curry, fish curry, and also for making sambar. It's an excellent flavoring agent, and it contains a very high hydroxycitric acid, which is a slimming agent. Okay, suppose you Google the slimming agent available to you, immediately Garcinia cambogia or Garcinia gummigata is, obtained. In fact, this is the $1 million resource as a slimming agent. Suppose you extract fat from the seed. The seed contains almost up to 40% edible ghee. In fact, in Uttar Kannada district, it is almost a delicacy. People in Ganesha festival, they make a lot of sweet out of this. So if you want to gain weight, eat this ghee. If you want to lose weight, you can go for this hydroxycitric acid beverage. You can alternatively use to keep it fit. So this is just a bounty of nature. We need to now look at the way that we can utilize. In fact, 80% of the hydroxycitric acid production in the world happens in Uttar Kannada. That goes from this particular species. Google it, you get Garcinia cambogia capsules, almost $23. It may contain 5 paise worth of HCA put into that particular capsule. Yeah, that is the kind of it. So for this, we need to now, the sum and substance of this particular exercise is that likewise, just like the Garcinia indica, we may have huge amount of elite trees of various resources. Just to give one example of Garcinia gummicata here, this is actually the range-wide variation for that we have identified in only 5 ranges of the Uttar Kannada. Another example that I would like to give you is of the Nothopoditis pneumoniana, which is called as uh, the the forted tree. It's called as Durvasane Mara in the sense that it really stings very badly when it flowers. The flowering actually happens today in this season during July and August, and then it's a small tree considered as a weed about 20 years back, but today it is another $1 million baby because a particular elite a chemotype called an anti-cancer alkaloid called camptothecin is actually obtained from this. In fact, you can Google and see the total worth of camptothecin industry in the world is $1 billion, largely contributed by the Chinese counterpart. We only contribute less than 5% of the entire thing. But this particular tree contains almost 100 times more CPT than the Chinese source. For this reason, the wood chips were smuggled. The 1 kg wood chips was sold, in the market at 80 rupees in the black market. As a result, 40% of the natural populations was lost. So what we did was, because we had this resolution data, we went and collected the uh, uh, different from different populations. We went and collected the ecotypes of Nothopoditis pneumonia or Mapia fotida, one and the same. These are all the samples that we did. We straight away went to the range, and then within a couple of days, we could identify the best populations, and then we took the samples and analyzed. And these are the different ecotypes. Some people call it as different species, but they all actually are cross compatible. And we understood that the CPT content of one of the regions, like the Mahabaleshwar region and in Thekadi region of Kerala, had 10 times, 100 times more camptothecin than the Chinese sources, suggesting that, in fact, every of these small exploration can actually make a huge amount of money or huge wealth to the nation. So this humble tree from the Western Ghats has now become a strategic resource of our country. So biodiversity becomes bioreserves only when we start identifying the resources and start conserving them. And then what we did was we developed some agrotechnology for this, and we standardized germination, vegetative propagation, and then we cloned the best kind of a material and started growing it in the arecanut garden, so that we didn't have to depend on the natural source of mapia. We can obtain it from the farmers, and in turn, farmers can actually some cash income, and the pharmaceutical industries can get continuous quality product without bothering the natural populations of this. So it also an increased utilization indeed adds to the conservation. So those two are the examples to suggest that, as I said, there are more than 1,500 tree species which are of actual or potential use. Each one of them can now be very well understood. If you are working with a smaller area like Puducherry or Goa or Dayudiman area, you can actually create almost an excellent spatial data of every resource, and then you can actually make your forest look like a wealth. Just to give an example of how do we compute the resource value of it, this was done by one of my friends in Pune. His name is Dr. Ankur Patwardhan. He actually worked out what is the resource potential of one medicinal plant of Chandoli National Park in Maharashtra. So again, he was a partner to us, and then he took this data and he used this data for calculation. Without going to the details of it, let me tell you that he calculated how many in how many grids this particular species occurs, what is the density of it, what is the biomass that we can obtain from the tree. Indeed, the camptothecin can be obtained from any part of the tree, especially of the wood. And he said, like if you completely cut off the entire Chandoli National Park area for this particular species of Nothopodatus pneumoniana, it's worth something like around 28 million US dollars. This may be an exaggeration, but I'm just trying to flag this issue just to know that how we can actually use this as a complete nice approach. So let me jump to the implications of Nagoya Protocol, because we are entering to the Nagoya Protocol very quickly, or we are already a signatory to the Nagoya Protocol. For this, let me not bore you with more data. Let me tell you a story. This is actually a true story. Most of the senior personalities must know about this, those who are working in the South. This humble plant is called as Arogyapacha in Malayalam, which is called the Trichomus xylonicus species Travancoricus. In the Agastyamalai region, there is a nomadic community called the Kani tribes, which are not more than 16,000 of them in the entire world. But they exactly know, they can track any track in the Agastyamalai region, and they know the knowledge of resources, particularly around them, is extremely good. So they don't come out and things of that sort. Okay, so way back, this is a story goes back to around 35 years back, perhaps, when TBGRS scientists were going for exploration and collection of this. These used to take the Kani tribes along with them for tracking. As you know, Agastyamalai is a very, very rugged place, and when you take this, when you go on this trekking, you get tired very quickly. So whenever the Kani people used to get tired, they used to go and chew the kernel of this particular Arogyapacha, and then after about half an hour, they used to feel great. There used to be rejuvenation of the entire body. In fact, one of the scientists say that he felt like God after eating this, basically because he was dead tired. But after eating the kernel, he became really very rejuvenated. So they did work on this. This is called as Varahi in Sanskrit, which has a magical plant with a great property to reduce the fatigue. They conducted research over 10 years and validation was done. Just to give one example, generally to understand anti-fatigue property, what they do is they keep this laboratory mice in a large water tank and allow them to swim. If you don't give anything, they can swim for about 3 hours. Suppose if you feed these mice with a synthetic steroid drug like amphetamine that boosts the stamina, they can swim for around 6 hours. But if you give the ingested macerated kernels of the fruits of Aragyapacha, they can go for around 18 hours of swimming. This is just to show you how one can actually do this work. So there was a patent done. People understood that it is not a steroid. It was well and good. And then it became three patents were actually floated by RRL Jammu. During the time, there was a patent licensing was done for about 10 lakh rupees. Yeah, 10 lakh rupees. And then about royalty of 2.5% of X factor sale. Look at this. Now, uh, Aragyapacha is a plant resource and the commercial product has been prepared based on the traditional knowledge by the uh, Kani tribes. And then there was some benefit that has obtained. Who should get this benefit? I cannot ask you a question. So what I will do is to go ahead. Uh, it was equally shared between the Kani tribes and the TBGRI scientists or the institute. And 25 tribal families were trained to cultivate this species because a tonic has been prepared called Jeevini, and then it's a commercial product and people will come and harvest this species. So each family earned about 8,000 rupees of money for the from the cultivation of this. So this created a ripple in the entire world. In fact, this was considered as the world's first forest-based product that perfectly exemplified the access and benefit sharing system involving indigenous people and the resource. In fact, it also backed the United Nations Equator Prize in 2002. And today, this GVN model is known as the ABS system or the access and benefit sharing system. So in this access and benefit sharing system, the genetic resources are used. In this case, the genetic resource is the Aragyapacha. And then there is a traditional knowledge called the anti-fatigue use. And the providers of this knowledge is Kani tribes. His name is Matan Kani. He is a provider and he has produced it, he has provided it to a user. The user is the TBGRI. And then all this created a wealth, either in the commercial or non-commercial. It actually created the commercial wealth, and whatever the monetary benefit that was obtained through this was siphoned back to the benefit was shared between the two. So this is the crux of or the essence of Nagoya Protocol, and it became operationalized almost 10 years back, and India is a signatory, and every one of us perhaps is one has to go through this. So the access and benefit sharing system refers to the way in which the resources are accessed and how the benefits that result from their use are shared between either the people or countries as users and providers. And using this particular law by the biodiversity law that is there, the Gujarat government successfully provided or made wealth to the nation as well as provided livelihood to the people. This is a famous Bhagat Mandli case. See, in Gujarat area, in the Dang's forest area, the Vaidyas are called as the Bhagats. Mandli is an association. What Gujarat government did was to create a federation of healers of this particular forest, and then from them the traditional knowledge was accessed and documented as a formal governmental initiative, and it was also placed in state gazetteer, so that nobody can say that this is my property. Now it became the property of the state. The resources were there in Gujarat. The traditional knowledge was there in the healers. They combined these two and made a knowledge base. And this knowledge base was offered to the private company, any private company. And one private company called Ambuka Herbal Private Limited, they developed actually the herbal drugs. They came forward and then they started communicating with the Gujarat government, and then they translated tribal traditional knowledge into the commercial product. They have milk productivity increase. They have they have drugs to increase the milk productivity, improve vitality of men, and then improving vitality of women, so on and so forth. And this is one best example of how the resource can be now converted into wealth, and then wealth can be shared among the owners of the traditional knowledge, thereby making the whole process a very rich process. So that was we are in the era of the Novaya protocol, and hence we need to perhaps think about how we can actually take the resources data into a new level by incorporating the provisions of Novaya protocol, provisions of the Biodiversity Act that we have, and a very rich resource base and the knowledge base that we have. When you can combine all this, we can really create wealth to the nation. So with this, I will just slip into some small practical steps of utilization to tree improvement. Very small steps that I would like to suggest here. If you look at what is happening to the tree improvement, our utilization of the timber resources in the country, species that are actively being managed for the productive aims is around 272. The genetic variability evaluated for 104 species, commercial seed produced for 27 species, out of which 21 are exotic and only 6 are native. That means we some of the stages of utilization of the timber species is entering to some kind of a dead end. So we identify the plus trees, we initiate a tree improvement program, but does not translate into a commercial seed production. So this we need to really address because we have completed half a century of the real tree improvement program after the independence, but still we are at this particular dismal state of tree improvement. This is also true. In fact, progeny trials are not also not very greatly done. Of course, this is little old data, but still the trend remains same. So even with the traditional tree improvement program, we need to increase. So my intention of putting this particular slide is that we need to bring in more colleges, or in those colleges where we have the in academia, we need to recruit people who have authentic education on the forestry, and there must be a recruitment drive for all the colleges of forestry in India, so that we start utilizing these resources more. Compare this with paddy. For instance, on one particular species like rice, there may be 5,000 people who are working, but one species like teak, may be hardly a handful of people that are there. When it comes to wood, it is still more dangerously poised. So as a policymaker, wherever necessary, you should be able to impress upon the government that we need more human resources to utilize the genetic resources. And second important thing that I would like to point out here is that we have identified over a period of time, excellent work has been done by the senior forest officers. They have created, identified excellent plus trees. The IWST has identified almost, couple of hundreds of plus trees. But all of them are there in the clonal bank plus trees, but anybody can access it. today I can go and get the clones of all the teak trees from the Andali Clonal Bank and then start my own company. But absolutely, there is no protection that is there in the sense that there may be physical protection, but what about the intellectual property protection? So we need to now molecular characterization of all the plus trees has to be done, and then varietal registration has to be taken on an urgent foot so that the IPR is protected. So this is a very, very valuable data or very valuable genetic resource that we have created. We really do not know how many private companies have taken away all our products and then they have started making their own money out of it. So one big thing is that if you register and then have the best molecular characterization done of this, we can sue anybody if he is actually, propagating any of our material. This can be done. There are couple of good institutes uh, like the Coimbatore TBGRI and then IWST. Anybody can take it up and then start doing this varietal registration. I will end my talk by actually flagging one immediate threat to the resources, which should be addressed very urgently, basically because the world is entering into an era of new tree death called through tree mortality. There is a wide scale tree mortality that is occurring, at least in the northern hemisphere, very vehemently, especially in Canada. So what you are seeing is acres and acres of pine forest. What you see as a red patch is actually a dried up or tree mortality patches, which is due to the one small beetle called the mountain pine beetle. Because of the increases in temperature fueled by the climate change, there is a huge death of the trees that's happening. It's also found in many of the aspen dieback in South Korea, it's happening. And if you carefully look at the white dots, all these white dots are the localities where the forest mortality related to climate stress, either from drought, high temperature, or from biotic stress is happening. In Asia, there are 14 reports. Documentation of such incidences, in fact, is low in case of India. In fact, very recently, last week, we had a visit to the Acacia auriculiformis plantation near our college, where 45% of the seedlings, which are 2-year old, have been affected by this trunk borer. It's a new kind of a borer that is there. So in fact, we are now getting every 3-4 months, the borer data is now becoming an extremely high. So this is quite alarming. We need to really address uh, if you want to build a climate resilient populations or good resource, we need to use the climate data, phenotypic data, and then genomic data, and then do that. So finally, the utilization has to be highly linked to the conservation in the sense that whenever we are using or increasing the production value of a particular species, like if you take teak, teak today, the clonal forestry may be extremely, very good. But when we increase the production value of it, the conservation value would go down. Like, the natural undisturbed forests have an extremely high conservation value. But when we have a plantation of a clonal plantation, it would have very low conservation value, but very high production value. Similarly, the management of intensity will be very high. So we need to now address this uh, and then bring some kind of a balance between the two. In fact, if you leave the wild population without improvement and continue the harvest, there would be genetic erosion coupled with decrease in the utilization. As against, if you improve the material, improve the utilization, give more access to the very good quality planting material, you can actually reduce the pressure on the wild population. So we need to not only encourage only clonal forestry of 1 or 2 clones, we need to bring in the aspect of genetic conservation there, but the efficient utilization itself will have a great impact on the conservation. So the big take homes that we have is that firstly, build a range wide, spatially explicit database on the resources. However small you should start, like, you can start with your own range, for instance, which is very good. Already existing data on IBM database is very well good. And then if some of you have an access to changing the working plan preparation, perhaps that can be now thought of. We should literally speed up the elite tree selection of the economically important species. We can improve the livelihood of the farmers through incorporating the improved bioresources that we develop. Molecular characterization and varietal registration of already identified elite lines is necessary. And then operationalizing the Nagoya protocol to garner exchequer to the resource utilization. In fact, imagine that 5 lakh rupees can be obtained by one small area of Arogya Pacha. Imagine we have 1,500 species of them. I don't think we will have any dearth of money for conservation and further utilization. And then we should address the immediate threat of tree mortality posed by climate change of the resources. Always think about conservation whenever you are utilizing this resource. Thank you very much. I think I rushed it a little bit, basically to save the time. Now I can take some questions if there are any.